South Carolina's probate records hold a document so controversial it remained sealed for 83 years. The last will and testament of Colonel Augustus Fairmont, dated March 1857, distributed his entire estate, valued at what would amount to millions today, to a single beneficiary, not to his wife of 26 years, not to his 3 legitimate children, not even to his brother, who had fought beside him in the Mexican War. The sole heir to Fairmont's 1,400 acres, his Charleston townhouse, his cotton factoring business, and his vast investments was a woman whose name appeared in his ledgers under a very different category of property. The reading of that will ignite a legal battle that consumed 3 law firms, tore Charleston society in 2, and exposed secrets that powerful families had spent decades trying to bury. Before we continue the story of Augustus Fairmont and the inheritance that should never have existed, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell, because stories like this don't appear in history books, and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience is uncovering these dark corners of American history. What makes the Fairmont case so disturbing isn't just what the will revealed, but what it forced into the open, the hidden structures beneath the polished surface of Southern gentility. Charleston in the 1850s embodied everything the antebellum South wanted the world to admire. White column mansions lined the Battery, their piazzas catching the harbor breeze. On Sunday mornings, church bells from St. Michael's and St. Philip's called the faithful to worship. In the afternoons, carriages rolled down Meeting Street, carrying ladies in silk dresses and gentlemen in fine broadcloth. The city's wealth flowed from rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton, the lifeblood of plantations that stretched across the Lowcountry like miniature kingdoms. Augustus Fairmont's plantation, Riverside, sat 30 miles inland along the Ashley River. The main house, built in 1789 by his grandfather, rose 3 stories high in the Georgian style, symmetrical, imposing, and built to project permanence. Live oaks older than the nation itself formed a grand avenue from the river road to the front portico. Behind the house stretched the working buildings, the kitchen house, carriage house, overseer's cottage, and farther back, beyond a stand of pines, the quarters where nearly 200 people lived under conditions that the law still called property ownership. Fairmont himself cut an imposing figure in Charleston society. At 47, he stood over 6 feet tall, carrying the proud bearing of a military man, which he had been during the Mexican War. He returned home with a commendation and a bullet still lodged near his spine, a constant reminder that gave him a slight limp in damp weather. He served on the vestry of St. Philip's, belonged to the South Carolina Society, the Hibernian Society, and the Agricultural Society. His opinions on cotton futures carried weight on Broad Street, and when he spoke publicly about states' rights and Southern sovereignty, people listened. His wife, Margaret Louisa Fairmont, came from the Rutledge family, old Charleston aristocracy with connections that mattered. She brought substantial dowry to their 1831 marriage. 30 enslaved people, $10,000 in railroad stock, and the kind of family name that opened doors. She bore Augustus 3 children who survived infancy: Catherine, born in 1832, Augustus Jr., born in 1835, and Margaret, called Meg, born in 1838. By all appearances, they embodied the ideal Southern family: prosperous, respectable, and devout. But appearances in Charleston society were carefully constructed performances, and the Fairmont household maintained that performance with exceptional rigidity. The household staff of both Riverside and the Charleston townhouse operated under the direction of a woman named Celia Rousseau. She was 28 in 1857, unusually light-skinned and literate, a dangerous combination that would have raised questions in any other household. Fairmont's ledgers recorded her purchase in 1843 from a Savannah estate sale for the extraordinary price of $1,500, triple the going rate, with no explanation for the premium. Celia held no formal title, yet she controlled access to Fairmont, managed his correspondence, and lived in a small room inside the main house rather than in the slave quarters. She dressed in simple but fine fabrics and always wore a gold locket that no one had ever seen her without. Her speech bore the marks of education well beyond her supposed station, and she moved to the Fairmont house with an authority that made visitors uneasy and made Margaret Fairmont's lips tighten in barely concealed rage. Plantation society had its unspoken rules about such arrangements. Men of means often kept relationships hidden in the shadows, producing children whose parentage everyone knew but no one acknowledged. As long as certain proprieties were observed, as long as the legal wife maintained her role, the children of those unions remained enslaved, and the entire structure stayed buried beneath genteel denial. Society could continue to function. Augustus Fairmont broke every one of those rules, though no one yet realized just how completely. The spring of 1857 brought an unusual drought to the Low Country. Rice fields that should have been flooded lay cracked and dry. Cotton prices had begun their slow decline, a fall that would accelerate into the panic of 1857 by August. In Charleston's drawing rooms, conversations turned increasingly toward Northern aggression, the Dred Scott decision handed down that March, and whether the Union itself could survive. The air was thick not just with humidity, but with the weight of a world beginning to fracture. At Riverside, the tension was personal. Margaret Fairmont had returned to Charleston in February, taking young Meg with her, and had not come back. Catherine, now 25 and still unmarried, a growing concern, remained in the city as well. Only Augustus Jr., training in his father's cotton factoring business, made occasional visits to Riverside. Even he, however, found reasons to keep them brief. The household at Riverside then consisted of The household now consisted primarily of Augustus, Celia, the field workers, and the immediate house staff. It was during this period of isolation that Augustus Fairmont began to make the arrangements that would ultimately shatter everything his family believed about their future. On the evening of March 14, 1857, Augustus sent word to Charleston, summoning his attorney, Josiah Prescott, to Riverside. The message, delivered by a trusted courier, instructed that Prescott come alone and bring everything necessary for drafting a complex testamentary document. Prescott, who had served the Fairmont family for 15 years, found the request unusual but not alarming. Wealthy men often revised their wills. What he did not expect, however, was a scene that awaited him in Fairmont's study 2 days later. In court years later, Prescott would testify that he arrived at Riverside on the afternoon of March 16th to find Colonel Fairmont visibly suffering. The colonel sat behind his mahogany desk, his face pale and drawn, one hand pressed against his lower back. A decanter of whiskey stood at his elbow, unusual for a man who typically drank with restraint. But most striking of all was Celia's presence. She was not there to serve, not waiting quietly in attendance, but seated calmly in the leather chair usually reserved for business associates, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression steady and composed. "Sir, I should perhaps call for Dr. Middleton," Prescott began, noting the sheen of sweat on Fairmont's forehead despite the cool March air. "No doctors," Fairmont rasped, his voice rough but resolute. "I know exactly what's wrong with me, Josiah, and no physician can cure it. I need you to write a will tonight, and I need it done exactly as I dictate, no matter what your professional judgment might suggest." Prescott hesitated, glancing toward Celia, whose presence made the situation profoundly irregular. "Colonel, these matters usually require witnesses, people who can read, write, and testify to your soundness of mind." Fairmont interrupted sharply. "Celia is one of the most intelligent people I know. She'll witness. You'll find 2 others among my people who can sign their names. I've already arranged it." Prescott's discomfort was evident, but Fairmont was a man of influence, a powerful client whose wishes could not be dismissed. With visible reluctance, Prescott opened his case and began preparing his papers. What followed was a dictation that lasted nearly 3 hours, frequently interrupted by Fairmont's struggle to master his pain. The will began conventionally enough, with the standard declarations of sound mind and body, though the latter was generous, and the formal revocation of all previous testaments. Then came the provisions that would upend everything. I give and bequeath to Celia Rousseau, Fairmont dictated, his voice deliberate despite the pain. Currently held as property at Riverside Plantation, her immediate and unconditional freedom upon my death, along with all documents necessary to establish her legal status as a free woman of color under the laws of South Carolina and the United States. Prescott's pen faltered. Manumission clauses were not unheard of, though increasingly constrained by state law. But Fairmont was only beginning. I further give and bequeath to the aforementioned Celia Rousseau, now be known as Celia Rousseau Fairmont, the entirety of Riverside Plantation, including all lands, buildings, equipment, livestock, and all persons currently held in bondage thereon. I further bequeath to her my townhouse at number 14 Trad Street in Charleston, along with all furnishings and household goods therein. The scratching of Prescott's pen stopped altogether. Colonel, I must strongly advise. Write it down, Josiah, Fairmont said, his tone sharp enough to silence any objection. I further bequeath to Celia Rousseau Fairmont all shares and interests in the firm of Fairmont and Lazarus, cotton factors, all railroad stock, all bank deposits, bond and securities, and all personal property of every kind and description. I appoint her sole executrix of this, my last will and testament, with full authority to act without bond or judicial oversight. The room grew very still, the only sounds of scratching of Prescott's pen, and the faint evening songs drifting from the quarters outside. Celia sat motionless, her face unreadable. Regarding my wife, Margaret Louisa Fairmont, Augustus continued, each word clearly an effort. I hereby grant her the legal minimum dower, right required under South Carolina law, 1/3 of my real property for the duration of her natural life. However, said dower right shall be subject to primary ownership and management of Celia Rousseau Fairmont, and Margaret Louisa Fairmont shall have no authority whatsoever in the administration of any property. Prescott had stopped even pretending to write. Colonel, he began carefully, your wife has legal protections. Your children have expectations. This will not stand in court. Beyond the legal impossibilities, a woman of color cannot legally own. Write it all down, Josiah, Fairmont interrupted. Exactly as I say it. There are ways around the restrictions, and you know it. Property can be held in trust. Arrangements can be made. I've studied the law. I'm not the first man to try to provide for her. He stopped suddenly, his breathing labored. Then, forcing the words out, write that I acknowledge Celia's son, Daniel, born June 12, 1844, as my natural child, and I direct that he be raised as a free man with all advantages available to him. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Daniel was 13 years old in 1857, a boy who worked in the Riverside stables and bore such a striking resemblance to Augustus Fairmont that only deliberate blindness could deny it. This written acknowledgement made explicit what society demanded remain forever unspoken. Furthermore, Fairmont continued, his voice weakening, I acknowledge Celia's daughter, Ruth, born April 3, 1847, as my natural child, and I direct that she be raised with the same advantages. 2 children. Not a single lapse in judgment, but an ongoing relationship lasting at least 13 years. 2 children who shared blood with the legitimate Fairmont heirs, yet had lived their entire lives in legal bondage to their own father. Prescott finally found his voice. Colonel, I cannot in good conscience allow you to proceed without understanding the consequences. Your wife will contest this immediately. Your children will never accept it. Charleston society will. Charleston society. Augustus cut him off, his tone carrying both exhaustion and defiance. Charleston society, Augustus said, his voice edged with unexpected venom, built its fortune on systematic rape and called it breeding stock. Every fine house along the Battery holds children whose fathers own them. Every so-called respectable gentleman conducts business by day and violates the very people he claims as property by night. The only difference, Josiah, is that I am telling the truth about it. I am putting into legal writing what every man in Charleston does under the cover of darkness." He leaned forward, the movement clearly costing him. "I am dying, Josiah. Dr. Middleton told me 6 months ago that the cancer spreading from my bowels would kill me within the year. I have hidden it from everyone. Everyone except Celia. I have weeks left, perhaps less, and I will not. I cannot leave this earth knowing that my own children will be sold to settle my debts, or that the woman I should have had the courage to marry openly will be returned to bondage when I die." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Prescott's hands trembled as he resumed writing. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the legal intricacies, the trust that might survive court challenges, the specific bequest designed to provide immediate liquidity, and the carefully worded clauses that attempted to navigate the narrow, perilous boundaries of South Carolina law on property and manumission. When the document was finally complete, Fairmont insisted on reading it himself, following each line with his finger despite the visible pain it caused. Then, with a steady hand, he signed it, the signature identical to the one that had graced hundreds of business contracts. Celia signed as witness, her handwriting precise, elegant, and unmistakably educated. 2 other enslaved people from Plantation were brought into witness as well. Samuel, the blacksmith who had taught himself to read, and Hannah, who had learned her letters from a former mistress. Prescott recorded their names and marks with visible discomfort. "I'll file this with my other documents," Prescott said carefully as he gathered his things. "But, Colonel, I urge you to reconsider. At least provide more substantially for your legitimate children. Make some gesture that might soften the blow." "My legitimate children," Augustus replied, and his voice carried a deep, exhausted weariness, "will inherit the protection of their mother's family name, the education I've already paid for, and the social position that comes with white skin in Charleston. Daniel and Ruth will inherit nothing but their freedom if I don't act now. The law sees them as things, Josiah, things I own, things that could be sold to pay my creditors if I don't make this ironclad." He turned toward Celia, and something unspoken passed between them, something Prescott could not name. "I've lived a coward's life," Augustus said softly. "Let me at least die honestly." Prescott left Riverside that evening carrying a document he knew would destroy lives, perhaps even his own career. As he rode back to Charleston through the dark, he wrestled with whether he had a moral duty to inform Margaret Fairmont of what her husband had done. In the end, perhaps out of his own cowardice, he decided that attorney-client privilege bound him to silence. That silence would allow the disaster to unfold unchecked. Augustus Fairmont lived another 6 weeks. During that time, he remained at Riverside, his condition deteriorating rapidly. Celia nursed him through the mounting pain, administering laudanum when it became unbearable, and reading to him in the evenings from books they had shared for years: history, philosophy, poetry. Daniel and Ruth were permitted to visit their father openly during those final days, a sight that scandalized the white overseers, though none dared to question it. Even in decline, Fairmont's authority commanded fear. Margaret Fairmont did not visit. Whether she had heard whispers of her husband's illness and chose to stay away, or whether Augustus himself had ensured that she never received word, history does not record. She remained in Charleston, attending luncheons and social functions, maintaining the illusion that her husband was simply preoccupied with plantation business during a difficult season. Augustus Fairmont died on the morning of April 28, 1857. Celia was with him at the end. According to later testimony from the house staff, his final words were, "Tell them the truth, all of it." The truth, when it came, would prove far more devastating than even he could have imagined. News of Colonel Fairmont's death reached Charleston the same day. Following custom, Margaret received visitors offering condolences at the Trad Street house. She wore black silk and greeted her guests in the parlor, accepting their sympathies with measured grace. Everyone remarked on her composure, on her strength during such a time of sorrow. She had no idea that she had already lost everything. The reading of the will was scheduled for May 3rd, 5 days after Augustus's death, And one day after his burial in St. Philip's churchyard, Margaret had insisted on a proper burial, despite her private fury over her husband's long absence and sudden demise. Only family and close associates were invited to the reading: her brother, James Rutledge, her 3 children, Augustus's brother, William, and several family friends who had long served as informal advisors. Josiah Prescott arrived at the Tradd Street house at 10 in the morning, carrying the will and looking like a man walking to his own execution. He had tried twice to meet privately with Margaret beforehand to prepare her, but she had been too occupied with funeral arrangements to see him. Now, he would have to deliver the truth publicly, before witnesses. Margaret sat in the largest chair in the drawing room, her children arrayed around her. Catherine, 25, had never married, a persistent source of tension between mother and daughter, especially after Augustus had refused to provide the generous dowry Margaret had demanded for the matches she arranged. Augustus Jr., 22, worked in his father's cotton factoring business and assumed he would inherit both the firm and the plantation. Meg, the youngest at 19, sat silently beside them, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of grace. The air in the room smelled faintly of furniture polish and the fresh flowers that had arrived continuously since the colonel's death. Spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the garden. Everything appeared proper, dignified, and civilized. Prescott cleared his throat. "Mrs. Fairmont, family members," he began quietly, "I must first say that the contents of Colonel Fairmont's last will and testament were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. I had advised strongly against several of its provisions, but the colonel was adamant, and, in my professional judgment, of perfectly sound mind when he dictated his wishes." Margaret's expression made it clear that she found this preamble unnecessary. "My husband was always particular about his affairs, Mr. Prescott. Please proceed with the reading." What followed would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Prescott moved quickly through the opening sections, the standard legal formalities, the revocation of all previous wills. Then his voice tightened as he reached the heart of the document, the words that granted freedom to Celia, that acknowledged Daniel and Ruth as Augustus's natural children, that transferred the entire estate to a woman who, when the will was written, had been legally his property. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The room was utterly still as the family tried to understand what they had just heard. Catherine looked confused, as though she must have misheard. Augustus Jr. leaned forward, his face twisting with disbelief. James Rutledge gripped the arms of his chair, and Margaret Fairmont sat perfectly still. Then Augustus Jr. exploded. "This is absurd. It's forgery. My father would never, he couldn't have." "Your father dictated this will to me directly," Prescott said quietly. "I witnessed his signature. The document has been properly executed, with multiple witnesses." "Witnesses?" James Rutledge's voice sliced through the growing chaos. "What witnesses? Who would witness such a document?" When Prescott explained that the witnesses included enslaved people who could read and write, including Celia herself, the room erupted. Voices collided in outrage. Augustus Jr. paced furiously, his fists clenched. Catherine began to cry, but Margaret remained silent, her face hardening into something that looked less like shock and more like confirmation of things she had long suspected. At last, she raised one hand, and the room fell silent. When she spoke, her voice was sharp and cold, like a blade. "How long?" Prescott blinked. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Fairmont. How long was my husband conducting this relationship with his property?" The attorney hesitated. "The will acknowledges children born in 1844 and 1847. 13 years, Margaret said softly. "My youngest daughter was born in 1838. For 19 years of our marriage, while I bore his children, managed his household, and maintained his place in society, he was—" She stopped, mastering herself with visible effort. "And this woman, this Celia, she now owns my home? The will provides for your dower right," Prescott answered carefully. "1/3 of the real property. for your lifetime, subject to her ownership, under her management. She owns the house, Margaret said faintly. I furnished that plantation. I helped build that business. My dowry helped establish it. Her voice dropped to a whisper, low, trembling, and more terrible than shouting could ever have been. And my children inherit nothing? Prescott had no words to soften the blow. By the will's provisions, Augustus Fairmont's legitimate children received no direct inheritance, no claim to the plantation, the Charleston properties, the business holdings, or even their father's personal effects. Everything, every last piece, had been left to Celia and her children. Augustus Jr. found his voice again. This is slavery's revenge. My father went mad. He must have been diseased in mind. Your father was in full possession of his faculties, Prescott said firmly. He knew exactly what he was doing. He stated plainly that he was correcting an injustice. Injustice? Catherine cried. He's made us beggars. We have nothing. How am I to marry with no portion? How is Augustus to continue the business? How is mother to live? The dower right provides, Prescott began. The dower right provides for us to live as dependents in our own home, at the mercy of a woman who was once property. James Rutledge shouted. He rose, trembling with fury. This is unconscionable. It's illegal. A woman of color cannot own property in South Carolina beyond the most limited degree. The property is held in trust, with arrangements that I believe will withstand legal challenge. Prescott said steadily. Colonel Fairmont studied the law extensively before drafting these terms. Margaret stood then, and her posture commanded silence. Where is she now, Mr. Prescott? Where is the woman who has taken my life? Prescott's reluctance was obvious. She remains at Riverside with the children, as the will specifies, is her right. Her right. Margaret tested the words like poison on her tongue. Send word to her. Tell her that the family wishes to discuss the terms of the will. Tell her we may be prepared to reach an accommodation to avoid the ugliness of a public contest. Tell her, she paused, her smile cold and terrible. Tell her I wish to meet my husband's other family. The message went to Riverside that same afternoon. Celia's reply arrived the next morning. She would come to Charleston, but only with legal representation present. She requested that the meeting be held at Prescott's office rather than the Trad Street house, and insisted that Daniel and Ruth would accompany her, as they had every right to hear what was discussed. The meeting was scheduled for May 8th. In the 5 days between Margaret's discovery of the will and that meeting, Charleston society ignited with scandal. The details leaked, perhaps through servants, perhaps through Margaret's allies, or perhaps simply because secrets this explosive never stay buried. By the end of the first week of May, everyone in Charleston's upper circles knew the story. Colonel Augustus Fairmont had freed his enslaved mistress in his will, acknowledged her children, and disinherited his white family to provide for them. The reactions fell along predictable lines. Many expressed outrage on Margaret's behalf, calling Augustus's actions a betrayal of everything civilized society held sacred. How could a man of his standing, his reputation, his position, commit such an act? Others, particularly among the younger men, whispered that Augustus had merely made public what half of Charleston practiced in secret. And a few, very few, dared to suggest that perhaps there was something admirable in what he had done. A man trying to provide for the children he'd fathered, regardless of their mother's race. But beneath all the public outrage ran something deeper: fear. If Augustus Fairmont, a man respected, wealthy, and deeply connected, could do this, what did that mean for the stability of every other family, every other arrangement built on the same foundation? How many more white families might find themselves displaced by the very people they had kept in bondage? The will represented a fundamental violation of the unspoken rules that allowed Southern society to function. It had to be challenged. It had to be defeated. Because if it wasn't, the implications would spread like cholera through the social order. The meeting on May 8th took place in Josiah Prescott's office on Broad Street, in a room far too small, for the number of people who crowded inside. Margaret arrived first, with her brother James, her children, and 2 additional attorneys she had retained, specialists in probate law from prominent Charleston families. They arranged themselves along one side of the long wooden table that dominated the room. When Celia arrived, the effect was immediate and visceral. She wore a dark gray wool dress, simple but well-made, with a crisp white collar. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She carried herself with remarkable composure for a woman walking into a room filled with people who wished her ruin. Daniel, just 13, wore a suit clearly tailored for him. Not a servant's uniform, but the kind of attire a gentleman's son would wear. Ruth, at 10, wore a blue dress with fine, careful stitches, her hair arranged in tidy braids. Both children bore the unmistakable Fairmont features, Daniel especially, with his father's strong jaw and deep-set eyes. The moment Margaret Fairmont and Celia Russo faced each other across that table contained more unspoken history than any document could ever capture. These 2 women had lived in the same house for 14 years, one as mistress, the other as property. Both had borne Augustus Fairmont's children. Both, in their own ways, had built their lives around a man who kept them in separate worlds that were never meant to collide. Now those worlds had collided, and one of them would not survive. Margaret spoke first, her voice calm but edged like cracking ice. "You understand, I presume, that my husband who cannot stand. The law protects a wife's rights. No court in South Carolina will allow such a travesty." Celia met her gaze directly, a deliberate defiance of every social code that dictated how a woman of color should address a white woman, especially one of Margaret's standing. "I understand," Celia said evenly, "that your husband chose to acknowledge the truth." Finally, the words landed like a physical blow. Margaret's composure faltered. Color rose in her cheeks. "You seduced him," she hissed. "You used your position in his household to manipulate a man who—" "I was 14 years old," Celia said, her voice low but steady, "when your husband purchased me in Savannah." Her tone grew sharper, the calm giving way to controlled intensity. 14. "I didn't seduce anyone, Mrs. Fairmont. I was taught to read and write by my previous mistress, which made me valuable as a household manager, or so your husband told people. But that wasn't the real reason he bought me. You can imagine what else I was purchased for, what I had no choice about." The room fell into dead silence. Augustus Jr. half rose from his chair, but James Rutledge caught his arm and forced him back down. "You will not speak to my mother that way," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "You have no right." "I have every right," Celia replied, turning toward her. Her tone was steel. "I have the right your father gave me in his will. I have the right of someone who managed your household, raised your children when they were small, kept your father's books, oversaw his business affairs while he was away, and bore his children, just as your mother did. The only difference is that I did all of it without choice, without protection, without the ability to say no. And now your father has finally tried to give me what he should have given me 13 years ago. My freedom, and the means to protect my children." Margaret's attorney, a gray-haired man named Bogart Simmons, cut in sharply. "Miss Russo," he said, "your personal history, however unfortunate, is not relevant to the legal questions at hand. Colonel Fairmont's will violates multiple provisions of South Carolina law. Property cannot be transferred in this manner to a woman of color. Children born of an enslaved mother are themselves enslaved and therefore cannot inherit. The dower rights of the legal wife supersede any testamentary provisions to the contrary. This will is legally invalid on multiple grounds." "Then why are we having this meeting?" Celia asked calmly. "If you're so certain the will is invalid, why not simply proceed to court?" Simmons and James Rutledge exchanged a brief glance. The truth was far more complicated than Celia's question suggested, and everyone in the room knew it. The legal landscape regarding property and race in 1857 South Carolina was a tangle of contradictions. The law severely limited what free people of color could own or inherit, but it also recognized trusts, private arrangements, and, most importantly, the wide latitude afforded to white men of property in disposing of their estates. Augustus had drafted the will with precision, using every legal mechanism available to make it as bulletproof as possible. And beyond that, a public court battle would expose details neither family wanted dragged into the light. James Rutledge cleared his throat. "We are here, Miss Russo, because despite the legal invalidity of this document, we recognize that a protracted court case would be unpleasant for all involved. The details of my brother-in-law's private life would become public record. Names would be named. Children would be examined. We are prepared to offer you a settlement that will provide for you and your children's future without the need for litigation." "How generous," Celia said, the sarcasm barely concealed. "What are the terms of the settlement?" Margaret leaned forward. "You receive your freedom, which the law would likely grant regardless. You receive $20,000, enough to establish yourself and your children comfortably anywhere north, where attitudes toward your situation might be more accommodating. In exchange, you renounce any claim to the Fairmont properties or business interests, and you leave South Carolina within 30 days. The offer was considerable in monetary terms. $20,000 was a fortune, but it was still a fraction of what the Fairmont estate was worth, and everyone in that room knew it. More importantly, it demanded that Celia, Fairmont, and Lazarus couldn't meet their own obligations. By October, the firm was effectively insolvent. For Margaret, the timing was disastrous. The assets she was fighting to secure were suddenly worth a fraction of their former value. Yet she pressed on, driven by pride, grief, and a determination that Celia Russo and her children would not profit from her husband's betrayal. The courtroom in Charleston's Court Common Pleas was crowded the morning the case opened. Reporters from as far away as New York had come to witness what some newspapers were already calling the most scandalous proceeding ever to touch the Carolina elite. On one side sat Margaret Fairmont and her attorneys, their table piled with ledgers, documents, and the weight of society's approval. On the other sat Celia, dressed plainly, her children beside her, and a few allies brave enough to stand with her. Judge Pinckney entered, his expression grave, his powdered hair gleaming under the gaslight. The bailiff called for order, and the first of what would be many witnesses took the stand. The Fairmont attorneys began their attack with precision. They called family servants, business partners, and even doctors to testify that Augustus Fairmont's mind had been clouded by illness and laudanum in his final weeks. They painted Celia as manipulative, insinuating that she had taken advantage of a dying man's weakness to secure wealth and position she could never have otherwise attained. When it came time for the defense to respond, Thomas Grimbaugh rose slowly. His voice, calm but steady, filled the courtroom. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are told that this was unnatural, that a man of position, education, and faith could not have meant to recognize his own children born in bondage. But perhaps the true unnaturalness lies not in the will, but in the world that made such recognition impossible. We are told that a woman who has lived her life as property cannot be trusted with freedom. Yet she managed her master's household, kept his accounts, raised his children, white and black alike, with more care than any of us can measure. Is it truly madness that a man, facing death, should at last attempt to right what life and law had made so grievously wrong?" The courtroom murmured. Judge Pinckney struck his gavel, but the moment lingered. For the first time, some in the audience felt the uncomfortable pull of conscience. Over following months, testimony revealed details that shocked Charleston society. Letters from Augustus to Celia, written in his own hand, spoke not of seduction but of guilt, affection, and a desperate wish for redemption. Witnesses confirmed that Celia had managed the Fairmont business affairs with skill during Augustus's long absences. Documents showed that the trust he established had been legally structured through northern intermediaries, technically valid, even under South Carolina law. Still, prejudice was stronger than reason. Judge Pinckney's rulings consistently favored the Fairmont heirs. Evidence supporting Celia's claim was excluded on technical grounds. Each day, the outcome seemed more certain. Yet public sentiment began to shift as newspapers in the North picked up the story, framing it as a test case for justice in the slaveholding South. Abolitionist pamphlets reprinted the testimony verbatim, portraying Celia as a symbol of moral courage. By the spring of 1858, the case had dragged on for nearly a year. Legal costs mounted, tempers frayed, and Charleston society split into factions. Some whispered that Margaret's relentless pursuit had become obsession. Others claimed that Grimbaugh was using the case to incite political unrest. The final verdict came on April 12, 1858. Judge Pinckney ruled that the will was invalid under South Carolina law. The property, businesses, and estates would revert to Margaret and her legitimate heirs. Celia and her children were granted manumission, their freedom, but nothing more. As the ruling was read, Celia sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, while Ruth began to cry softly. Margaret did not look at them. She rose, accepted the judge's congratulations, and left the courtroom without a word. But outside, as Celia stepped into the harsh Charleston sunlight, something remarkable happened. A crowd had gathered, free blacks, abolitionists, and even a few sympathetic whites. They didn't cheer, but they stood in silence, creating a passageway for her to walk through. In that moment, though she had lost nearly everything, Celia Russo was no longer invisible. Within weeks, she and her children left South Carolina for Philadelphia, carrying little more than the clothes they wore and a few of Augustus's letters. In the North, they began anew, anonymously at first, then quietly building lives that defied the fate so many had predicted for them. And in Charleston, the Fairmont estate never recovered. The Panic of 1857 had left deep scars. By the time the Civil War began just 3 years later, the family's fortunes had vanished, their name little more than a bitter echo of what once was. But somewhere in Philadelphia, a woman once owned as property lived to see both her children educated and free, and that, in the end, was a legacy no court ruling could erase. Middleton paused, his gaze shifting toward Margaret, whose face had gone pale. He told me, the doctor continued quietly, that he had wronged them, Ms. Russo and the children, and that he meant to make restitution before his death. He said he could not stand before his God having denied his own blood. The words fell over the courtroom like a shroud. Even Judge Pinckney, normally impassive, seemed unsettled. For a long moment, the only sound was the scratching of quills as reporters frantically recorded every word. Margaret's attorney rose sharply. Dr. Middleton, are you suggesting that Colonel Fairmont was of sound mind when he drafted this will? I am saying, Middleton replied, that he was clear-minded, deliberate, and aware of what he was doing. He was a dying man trying to set his affairs in order, not a madman, not a victim of manipulation. The prosecution's case, built on the assumption of Augustus's incapacity, began to crumble. Yet for Celia, the moral weight of her situation only deepened. She sat silent as the testimony unfolded, her face composed but her eyes distant, as if watching events she could no longer control. In Charleston society, whispers multiplied. Some pitied her, others despised her, but nearly all were transfixed. The notion that a woman once enslaved might inherit the estate of a respected white planter challenged every rule that upheld their world. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the corruption of natural order. Newspapers debated whether the court should allow social anarchy to masquerade as justice. And yet, Celia's actions spoke louder than any sermon. Despite the legal siege and social hatred surrounding her, she continued managing the Fairmont properties as best she could. With Grimble's guidance, she restructured the estate's debts, liquidated failing investments, and even ensured that wages, meager though they were, continued for free laborers on a riverfront warehouse. By early 1858, it was clear that she had accomplished something no one thought possible. She had stabilized the collapsing Fairmont empire, but instead of earning respect, her success only inflamed resentment. To many of Charleston's elite, it was intolerable that a woman of color, a woman who had once been owned, had outmaneuvered men who considered themselves her betters. In February, Margaret's attorneys introduced a new line of attack. They claimed Celia's management decisions, particularly the sale of enslaved workers, proved she lacked the moral discretion necessary to hold property under the law. It was, they argued, evidence that her freedom itself had been a mistake. Grimble countered that this was hypocrisy of the highest order, that those who had lived their entire lives profiting from human bondage had no standing to question Celia's desperate attempts to prevent financial ruin. The tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Witness after witness was called, merchants, clerks, neighbors, each adding fuel to the fire. The proceedings dragged through spring and into summer, and by then, Charleston social season revolved almost entirely around the trial. The Fairmont case had become a theater of moral contradictions, a mirror held up to society that sustained it. When Dr. Middleton's cross-examination concluded, the defense rested its case. Grimble's closing argument lasted nearly 3 hours. He spoke not as a lawyer, but as a man appealing to conscience. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice resonating to the packed chamber, "you have heard talk of bloodlines and property, of who may own and who must be owned. But beneath all that language lies a single truth. A man named Augustus Fairmont sought, in his dying days, to right the wrongs he himself had committed. His widow seeks to erase that act. His mistress seeks to preserve it. Which of those choices, I ask you, honors his memory?" The courtroom was silent when he finished. Even those who despised Celia could not deny the eloquence of his words. Judge Pinckney recessed the court for a week before rendering his decision. When he returned, his ruling struck a delicate but devastating balance. The court, he declared, could not recognize a will that placed a woman of color, enslaved or free, in possession of white property under South Carolina law. Yet he also acknowledged that Augustus Fairmont's intent was clear and his mind sound. Therefore, Celia Russo and her children would be granted manumission, their freedom legally confirmed. But the estate itself would revert to Margaret Fairmont and her heirs. The decision satisfied no one. Margaret had regained her wealth, but not her dignity. Celia had won her freedom, but at a price measured in loss, sacrifice, and moral torment. Outside the courthouse, as news spread, the crowd broke into argument, some jeering, others weeping. Celia stepped out into the heat of a Charleston afternoon, her children at her side, and for a brief instant she looked back at the building behind her. It was over. The law had spoken, but history, she knew, would speak differently. Visibly uncomfortable, he confessed that he had fathered 5 children in total, 3 with his wife and 2 with Celia. He said he had failed all 5 of them in different ways, but at the very least, he could ensure that Daniel and Ruth would be free. Did he express any concern for the welfare of his legitimate children? He said they would inherit the protection of their mother's name, along with all the advantages of being white in Charleston. He was very deliberate in that phrasing. Just when the courtroom thought the tension couldn't rise any higher, Margaret's attorney asked a question that would completely explode the case. "Dr. Middleton, in your professional opinion, was Colonel Fairmont's judgment impaired by illness or medication?" "No." "Did he seem rational?" "Completely." "Then why, in your medical opinion, would a rational man of his stature commit such an act of social and familial destruction?" Dr. Middleton looked directly at Margaret Fairmont. "He told me something else," he said. "He told me that he had lived his entire adult life, following rules that forced him to lie about who he was and what he wanted. He said Southern society demanded that men like him maintain 2 families, one public, one private, and never acknowledged the truth of either. He said he was tired of lying. He told me that dying focuses a mind wonderfully on honesty, and that the greatest crime he ever committed was not the relationship with Celia. It was purchasing her in the first place, owning another human being, and fathering children into bondage. He said if the law would not allow him to correct that crime, then the law was more corrupt than he was." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Pinckney was forced to recess for 15 minutes to restore order. Margaret left the courthouse that day surrounded by her supporters, but the damage had been done. Augustus's own doctor had testified that there were reflected not confusion, but moral clarity. that the man everyone thought they knew had been living a lie he finally chose to expose. The testimony fractured Charleston society in ways that went far beyond one family scandal. Men who had attended church with Augustus, done business with him, and maintained their own secret families suddenly had to confront the possibility that he had been right to tell the truth. Women who had chosen willful ignorance about their husband's behavior were forced to wonder what might be happening within their own households. The case stopped being about one will. It became an indictment of the entire social structure of the South. Then, in January 1858, something happened that changed everything once again. Ruth Fairmont, Celia's 10-year-old daughter, fell ill with scarlet fever. The disease swept through Charleston that winter, claiming the lives of dozens of children. Celia, desperate to save her daughter, hired the best physician she could find, and she had the money to do so thanks to the state she now controlled. Margaret's attorneys tried to argue that Celia had no right to use estate funds for medical treatment of a child who wasn't legally recognized. But that argument, made openly in court, proved too much even for Charleston's tolerance of hypocrisy. Judge Pinckney, clearly wrestling with his conscience, made a ruling that stunned everyone. This child is ill. Her father acknowledged her as his daughter in his will. Whatever this court decides about the distribution of Colonel Fairmont's estate, we will not allow a 10-year-old girl to die while lawyers debate property rights. Miss Russo is authorized to use estate funds for the child's medical care. It was the first time the court had acknowledged Ruth's humanity above her status as property, a small but historic crack in the legal armor Margaret's side had built. Ruth survived, though the illness left her weakened. Yet the public's sympathy for the sick child, combined with the doctor's testimony about Augustus's motives, began to shift public opinion in subtle but meaningful ways. Not among Charleston's elite, who remained committed to preserving the social order, but among the merchants, tradesmen, and small farmers who read about the case in the newspapers. These were not people with enslaved property to protect. They were people who could see the human tragedy beneath the legal arguments. By the spring of 1858, both sides were exhausted, financially and socially, by the ongoing battle. The estate's remaining assets were being devoured by legal fees. Margaret had been forced to take loans from her brother just to maintain appearances. Celia lived in a strange limbo, legally controlling vast properties, yet socially ostracized to the point that merchants refused to deal with her directly. And then, Thomas Grimble made a move that pushed the case to its breaking point. On March 12, 1858, Grimble filed a new motion that completely reframed the entire case. Instead of merely defending Augustus's will, he went on the offensive, demanding a full accounting of how the Fairmont estate had been managed during Augustus's lifetime. Every property purchase, sale, and transfer, with special attention to acquisitions made after 1843. The motion seemed purely procedural, but its implications were explosive. Grimble had found something in Augustus's papers, and he intended to use it. The hearing on the motion took place on March 20th. The courtroom was more crowded than ever, as word spread that something major was about to happen. Grimble took the floor with the calm confidence of a man holding a winning hand. "Your Honor," he began, "the Fairmont family has maintained throughout these proceedings that Miss Celia Russo is property, that she had no legitimate relationship with Colonel Fairmont, and that she has no legal standing to inherit his estate. I would like to introduce into evidence a document found among Colonel Fairmont's private papers." He held up a piece of aged, carefully preserved parchment. This is a manumission document executed in Savannah, Georgia, on April 3, 1847, 10 years before Colonel Fairmont's death. It grants freedom to Celia, a woman of color approximately 28 years of age, in consideration of faithful service and other valuable considerations. The document is properly notarized and filed with the Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Margaret's face turned white. Grimble continued, his voice growing stronger. This document was executed on the day of Ruth Fairmont's birth, Colonel Fairmont's second daughter by Celia. "Miss Russo," Grimble continued, his voice calm but charged with the weight of revelation. "Under the law, A child born to a free woman is born free, regardless of the father's status. Ruth Fairmont was never enslaved. She had been legally free since the moment of her birth. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the courtroom to absorb them before delivering his next blow. Furthermore, he said, lifting another document, I have here a second record, executed in Charleston on June 15, 1844, 3 days after the birth of Daniel Fairmont. This document, also a manumission, grants freedom to Celia and her infant son, Daniel, under similar terms. Margaret's lead attorney, Simmons, immediately shot to his feet. Objection! These documents were never presented before. These documents, Grimble interrupted evenly, were hidden by Colonel Fairmont himself. He concealed them because he knew that acknowledging them publicly would endanger his children. A free woman of color in South Carolina lived in a perilous position. Her children, even if free by law, could be kidnapped and sold into bondage. It was safer for everyone if the world believed Celia and her children were enslaved, even though they had not been for more than a decade. Judge Pinckney leaned forward, his face grave. You're telling this court that Miss Russo has been legally free since 1847 and her son since 1844? I'm saying more than that, Your Honor, Grimble replied. I'm saying that for 13 years, Colonel Augustus Fairmont maintained the illusion that Celia was his property, while in truth, he had already freed her. He did this not out of cruelty, but out of protection. He knew that a free woman of color with children who could pass as white lived in constant danger. But the legal reality is unmistakable. Celia Russo has not been property for over a decade. She has been a free woman living in the Fairmont household. The implications rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. If Celia had been free, then her relationship with Augustus was not one of master and slave, but something entirely different. If her children had been born free, then they were not property, but rightful heirs. And if Augustus had secretly protected them under the guise of enslavement, freeing them long before his death, then it was not an impulsive act of conscience, but the culmination of a carefully planned design. Margaret finally found her voice, raw and trembling with anguish. He freed her, she cried. He freed her on the day our daughter was born. While I lay in childbed, risking my life to bring him another child, he was at the courthouse freeing his mistress. The raw pain in her voice silenced even those who had come to support her. The wound was laid bare. Not only had Augustus been unfaithful, but he had been building a future for Celia while Margaret brought his legitimate children into the world. He had used the law to protect one family, while allowing the other to believe itself secure. Grimble seized the moment. Your Honor, he said firmly, in light of these revelations, I move that this court formally recognize Ms. Russo's legal status as a free woman and acknowledge that Colonel Fairmont's was not a manumission, but a testamentary transfer of property from one free person to another, something he had every right to do under the law. The dower rights still apply. Simmons protested desperately. Mrs. Fairmont retains the protections the law affords her. Indeed, Grimble countered. Mrs. Fairmont will receive her 1/3 dower share as required by law. The remainder of the estate passes to Miss Russo, exactly as it would if Colonel Fairmont had left his property to any other free person. Judge Pinckney called for a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of the revelations pressing on every mind. Margaret left, supported by her children, her face a frozen mask of devastation. Celia remained seated, Daniel beside her, both struggling to comprehend what had just been revealed. Mother, Daniel said softly, did you know about the manumission papers? Celia shook her head. He told me they existed, she whispered. He told me to trust him, but I never saw them. I think, her voice faltered, I think he knew that if I believed I was free, I would act differently, and that might have put us all in danger. It was safer for me to think I was still enslaved, to live as though I were, to never challenge the illusion. He protected us by making us complicit in our own bondage. The psychological weight of what Augustus had done was almost unbearable. He had freed the woman he loved, but forced her to live as property. He had ensured his children were born free, but raised them as slaves. He had built an elaborate legal shelter for them, while maintaining the facade of ownership to the world. Every act of love had been an act of cruelty. Every protection had also been a cage. 2 weeks later, the court reconvened for Judge Pinckney's ruling. He looked worn and conflicted. His written opinion stretched over 40 pages, filled with legal reasoning that tried to reconcile the law, precedent, and the moral quagmire the case had unearthed. His conclusion was narrow but devastating to Margaret's claim. The Manumission documents were valid. Celia had been free since 1847, and her children since their births. Therefore, Augustus's will was simply a legal transfer of property from one free person to another, permissible under South Carolina law, subject only to the dower provisions. Margaret received her 1/3 lifetime interest in the real property, as the law required. But Celia received control of 2/3 of the real estate, all personal property, business holdings, and liquid assets. More importantly, she received something beyond wealth, the law's acknowledgement of her personhood. She was not property. She had not been property for over a decade. She was a free woman of color with the same legal rights to own and inherit property as any other free citizen under South Carolina law. The decision was appealed to the South Carolina Court of Appeals, but the higher court refused to hear it, allowing Judge Pinckney's ruling to stand. The long legal war was over. After 18 months, countless dollars in legal fees, and exposure of secrets Charleston society had fought to keep buried, Celia Russo had won. But her victory, when it came, was hollow in ways no one had anticipated. Celia took possession of the estate. Margaret, exercising her dower rights, chose to remain in residence. The law granted her that privilege, and she used it with bitter satisfaction, forcing Celia to endure her presence. For 2 years, the two women lived under the same roof, barely speaking, occupying separate floors, each one both victim and villain in the other's story. The arrangement couldn't last. It proved emotionally and psychologically unbearable for everyone involved. Margaret's children refused to visit their mother as long as Celia lived under the same roof. Charleston society avoided any gathering that might include both women. Inside the house, the servants lived in constant unease, never certain whose orders to follow when the two women's commands conflicted. By 1860, Margaret finally gave up. She left the Charleston house and moved to her brother's plantation farther inland, taking with her the only thing she truly desired from her marriage, the legal title of Mrs. Augustus Fairmont. She lived another 32 years, passing away in 1892, and never once spoke her husband's name in public again. Catherine never married. She stayed with her mother until Margaret's death, then moved to Columbia to live with cousins. She supported herself by giving piano lessons and died in 1901. Poor but respectable, Augustus Jr. tried to make his own way in the cotton trade, but his father's reputation haunted him. Few planters wanted to do business with the son of a man who had abandoned his white family for his enslaved mistress. In 1865, after the war, he moved to Texas and vanished from history. Family letters suggest he died sometime in the 1880s, but no grave has ever been found. Young Mag married in 1862, just before the war made weddings nearly impossible. Her husband, a junior Confederate officer, was killed at Gettysburg. She never remarried, working as a governess until her death in 1909. The Civil War erased what was left of the Fairmont fortune. Riverside was occupied by Union troops. The fields burned, the mansion looted, and the Charleston townhouse damaged by shelling. Every business interest collapsed along with the Confederacy. By 1865, the immense wealth that had once fueled so much bitterness was gone, dissolved in the same fire that tore the South apart. But Celia and her children survived. They left Charleston in 1860, sensing the disaster that was coming. Using the last of the estate's liquid assets, Celia bought a small property in Philadelphia, in a neighborhood built by free people of color. She invested in a boarding house and a modest shop, ventures that gave her a steady income. Daniel received an education. He learned carpentry and became a skilled craftsman. He married in 1868, raised a family, and lived to see the 20th century. He died in 1921 after 57 years as a free man, leaving behind property and stability that his grandchildren inherited. Ruth, who had nearly died as a child, grew into a woman of remarkable strength. She became a teacher, educating freed children during Reconstruction. In 1870, she married a minister. Her descendants spread across Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, becoming teachers, doctors, and lawyers, building lives that would have been impossible in the world she was born into. Celia lived until 1889. She never remarried. She kept the small gold locket Augustus had given her until the day she died. Inside were two photographs, one of Daniel as an infant, the other of Ruth as a toddler. She was buried in Philadelphia's Eden Cemetery, in a plot she had bought herself. Her headstone reads simply, Celia Russo Fairmont, 1819 to 1889, free. The case of Fairmont versus Fairmont Estate never found its way into standard law textbooks. It appeared occasionally in property law discussions, but only in the footnotes. The details were too uncomfortable, the implications too disturbing. Charleston society preferred to forget the whole ugly affair, burying it beneath the more dramatic tragedy of the Civil War. Yet the document survived. Hundreds of pages of testimony, motions, and evidence preserved in the Charleston County Courthouse. They survived war, fire, and flood, even efforts to erase them from the record. And in those pages lies the true story of a man who tried to correct an injustice he had spent his life creating, and how his attempt at redemption shattered two families in his effort to save one. The questions raised by the case were never answered. Was Augustus Fairmont a hero for trying to free his children, or a villain for enslaving them in the first place? Was Celia a victim of oppression, or someone who found a fragile advantage within it? Was Margaret's rage justified, or was she defending a system that could never be justified? Could any of them have chosen differently in the world they lived in? The truth, according to the record, is that everyone involved was trapped in a system that poisoned every human relationship it touched. Augustus's desperate attempt at honesty within a society built on lies revealed just how deeply those lies had infected everything: family, law, property, love, and even parenthood. His will didn't repair what was broken. It simply exposed the full extent of the damage. In the end, the greatest legacy of the Fairmont case may be what it revealed about the doomed foundation of the Southern world. A society that demanded men own their own children could not endure. A civilization built on a lie that some people were less than human was destined to collapse. 3 years after Judge Pinckney's ruling, the Civil War came, burning away the legal structures that had made cases like Fairmont's possible. Yet it would take another century before descendants of people like Celia and Daniel could fully claim the rights Augustus Fairmont died trying to give them. And even now, the echoes of that world remain, buried in the soil, in the architecture, in the quiet assumptions about power, property, and who deserves what. The Fairmont Plantation House still stands, partially restored, now operating as a museum. Tour guides speak of its architecture, its furnishings, and the famous visitors who once passed through its halls. Sometimes they mention the controversial will, though only in passing. They rarely talk about what the case truly exposed, the moral rot of the foundation of Charleston's grandeur. But in the courthouse archives, the file still waits, thick with testimony and dust, ready for anyone curious enough to open it and read the record of a world that tried so hard to keep its secrets. So, what do you think of the story? Did Augustus Fairmont find redemption in his final act? Or did he only add one last cruelty, forcing 3 families to suffer for his lifetime of cowardice? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this historical mystery compelling, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more true stories from America's darkest chapters. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who values the uncomfortable, complex truths hidden in our past. The past is never as simple as we want it to be, and sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened.